Good evening, dear friends. So my colleagues from Garage Museum asked to start tonight's lecture, which is going to be not so much about art, but more about culture and issues around media.
Я сам жду ее с огромным любопытством и интересом.
So we are having Giuliana Bruno today, and I hope you will find it interesting. It's a joint lecture organized by Garage Museum of Contemporary Art and Moscow Art Magazine, Khudoshestvenny Zhurnal. It is published in Moscow since 1993.
До сегодняшнего дня на русском языке это, собственно, ведущая, если нельзя сказать,
and it's one of the leading publications about art and culture.
Я работаю в журнале с самого его основания. Всегда делать художественный журнал было большим удовольствием.
I have always enjoyed working on art magazine.
Радость создания номеров сочеталась, конечно, и с мукой.
Of course, it was always very hard to publish every edition. Each of magazine edition was connected with risk, hardship, and that's why it's a real pleasure for me to open our joint program with Garage Museum. I can say that our work has been stabilized and we have been comforted by Garage Museum. So it's sheer pleasure now and no more tortures. So it's really great that Garage Museum not only decided to support the magazine but also to get some feedback from us as a contribution to their work and activities. So it will be a new page in the history of our relations, and I hope it will develop further. I'm not going to introduce our lecturer. I know because I give lectures very often that, whenever somebody introduces me, they have to give a very long list of all sorts of publications and our titles. So if you're interested in who Giuliana Bruno is, you can always find a lot of information on the internet and in different encyclopedia. I can just mention two things. First of all, I would like to explain why we are having Giuliana Bruno today. She is the writer and co-author of the last edition of our magazine. It's called The Politics of Feelings. So this lecture is going to be partially a presentation of this edition. She is the author of this edition. So there is a long list of key authors. You can see them all on the cover of our art magazine. So when we were thinking about the presenter, I can say that she was our first choice because she has a great text, and this text forms the basis for our edition. And the sphere of her interests is very broad. So along with this resonance with our topic of our magazine, but she also resonates very well with this place where we are today, Garage Museum of Contemporary Art. She reflects on many things, both in our magazine and in her book. Actually, we took a fragment of her book and published in our magazine. So she touches upon the issue of museum, for example, in a very interesting way. How the museums are readable by the viewers, and what kind of symptom what museum acts as a public institution, how it correlates with other spheres of cultural production. It's really important for Giuliana Bruno to examine film, and this is one of the key practices that she focuses on, because contemporary art and culture relies on it to a great extent. For example, exhibition and film, including editing and cutting. So there is a broad range of themes and issues which gives a very important comment to Garage creative experience. Garage is a very special institution, a reflective institution, and it does this self-reflection regularly, trying to understand what kind of new possibilities a museum institution might have while exhibiting art and culture. So this is what I wanted to tell you today, to open our lecture by Giuliana Bruno. And now I would like to give the floor to her.
Thank you very much to the Garage Museum for this wonderful invitation, and to the Moscow Art Magazine for publishing my work. And I want to extend some special thanks to Victor Misiano for making it possible for me to come to Moscow for the first time. I'm really happy to be here. And also to Anna Mihalenko from the Garage Museum for everything she's done for me to be here. I am really happy to be able to visit your wonderful city, and I'd like to thank you all for coming here tonight. I'm sorry that I don't speak Russian. I'm Italian, so English is already a second language for me, but I'm sure a wonderful translator, if you need it, will convey my thoughts. In responding to the Garage invitation into the Moscow Art Magazine and to Victor's prompt, I want to give a lecture that expands on some of the ideas of my new book, Surface, Matters of Aesthetics, Materiality, and Media. One of the interests that Victor mentioned of my work has to do with the return to sensibilities and sensations, to hapticity, to different forms of touching in art. And this is one of the reasons why I was interested in the surface. Surface is the most tender of material. It's something that can be touched and touches us, and also connects together different forms of expression and different art forms. It begins with the skin. The first surface is epidermic. It's the way in which we come into contact with other people. And then surfaces are also the textures of the clothes that we wear, with which we present ourselves to the world. And then there is the surfaces of the canvases of the work we look at. The facades and the walls that we inhabit are surfaces. And then, of course, the screens, which are now everywhere as the material condition of our existence. So I wrote this book to defy an assumption that surface is superficial. There's nothing more important than the surfaces, because it in fact connects together everything in life and in art on the same tone. So I'm interested in exploring some of these ideas about surface materiality, with you today. And I will start with a passage that has been inspirational for me to think about this topic. It's from Lucretius, a Latin poet and philosopher who was very interested in the surface of things. Very, very long time ago, he wrote in a book called De Rerum Natura on the nature of things, about surfaces. And I will read you a passage from Lucretius. There exist what we call images of things, which, as it were, peeled off from the surfaces of objects and fly this way and that through the air. I say, therefore, that likeness or thin shapes are sent off from the surfaces of things, which we must call, as it were, films or bark. For Lucretius, the image is a surface, the surface of things. It is a piece of cloth and released as matter that flies out into the air. This philosopher was an Epicurean and suggested to us something important. The material of an image manifests itself on the surface. Lucretius describes the surface of things as something that may flare out, giving forth dazzling shapes. It is as if it could be virtually peeled off, like an actual layer of skin, forming what he calls a bark, leaving a sediment, a veneer, a film. It's interesting, I don't know how it is in Russian, but in English, film means both moving image, but also pellicule. The pellicule in French as well, la pellicule, which is an epidermis, it's actually a skin. So it's really the skin of things. This poetic description and the philosophical implication go to the heart of my concern in this lecture, which addresses matters of surfaces and especially of the fabric of the screen. In reflecting on the configuration of the screen as a material of transformation in contemporary art, I expand upon a central concern of the book I mentioned, Surface, Matters of Aesthetics, Materiality, and Media, where I turn the surface in order to investigate the importance and the return to materiality in contemporary visual culture, what is known as a material turn. In the age of virtuality, was my question, with its rapidly changing materials and media, what role can materiality have? How is it fashioned in the arts or manifested in technology? Could we refashion a different form of materiality in our virtual age? I asked those questions at a time when contemporary artists themselves are really preoccupied with materiality in different forms and are questioning the material conditions of their mediums and the way in which their mediums are constituted. Take, for example, Francis Alice, moving image work Real Unreal from 2011, an artist who lives in Mexico City and is of Belgian origin. Here he made an homage to the resilience of cinema as a cultural archive. So thinking about cinema and the museum as both being archives of memory. The camera in this film follows a reel of film as it unrolls through the old part of the city of Kabul, pushed by children like a hoop to create an improvised narrative of the city. Here, at the very moment of film's obsolescence or demise, at the time when cinema appears to be dead, a reel of film can in fact take a particular significance and become a different matter and a different object. It could be refashioned into another object and become transformed into a way of unfolding space and reimagining the form of an urban condition. I argue that in this transformative way, there is a potential for reinvention of materiality in our times. I claim that it is very visibly and actively pursued in the visual arts, in both residual and textural forms. So I want to open up a space for the reinvention of materiality in the arts and for the theorization of materiality in contemporary culture. Most importantly, I contend that materiality is not about the materials per se, but it's about reinventing material relations. I'm interested in the space of material relations and in showing how they are configured and transformed on the surface of different media. Thinking about the surface of things, the architect Le Corbusier wrote that, and I quote, "Architecture is the magnificent play of masses brought together in light, and the task of the architect is to vitalize the surfaces which clothe these masses, which dress the masses." End quote. This idea inspires the theoretical direction that I propose in approaching materiality as a surface condition. The surface is for me configured like an architecture. It is an architecture. It is a partition, right? It divides, but it can also be shared like a skin. It's the connection between interior and exterior. It makes it possible to both have a border and at the same time make a passage. And it is the primary form of habitation for the material world, from our skin to the skin of thing to the walls as our skin. The surface is also for me, therefore, a zone of encounter and a zone of mixture, and the way in which we configure and reconfigure the relation between ourselves and the space and the object that surround us. So the surface could also be a form of memory and transformation because it connects everything together. And we should in fact consider that, as I mentioned earlier, architecture, fashion, design, film, and the body all share an engagement with the surface, and they're all, in a sense, superficial matters. In this way, we can observe how the surface is a connective thread between these art forms. So instead of considering art as separate from architecture or from fashion or design or film, if we consider that the surface connects them together, we can also see the intersection between all of these art forms and how they structure our communicative existence in the contemporary world. This more philosophical premise about the surface and surface materiality leads me now to speak about the material condition of the film medium and address specifically the surface of the screen. I propose to make a material turn in visual studies in order to vitalize the surfaces, the cloth, the material of the art objects, and show the materiality today in the arts manifests itself in projection, in what I like to call the surface tension of media. In particular, I would like to turn to the screen as an environment of projection, understanding projection in the largest sense of the word, as an architecture of passage, of connection, of contact, and of transition, highlighting texture and materiality, surface and light. Projection is indeed a space of relation, and it is today in the museum and in the art gallery becoming an actual environment. We are surrounded by screens everywhere, and especially in the museums. This is also true of architecture. Architects are increasingly turning the facades and the interior of their buildings and the walls into screens, making them into translucent surfaces as permeable and layered as skins. As much as artists are reinventing the art of projection in the art gallery and the contemporary museum. So we, as visual theorists, have to contribute to this changing in the art worlds and in architecture by providing some concrete reflections on these intersecting architectures, thinking further about the reflective surface. The projective mode and the visual plasticity, a sartorial texture that's emerging in the face and the facade of art and architecture, and also about translucency. So that is about the luminous material transference that is connecting together all these mediums. As far as the screen is concerned, it is time to design an alternative genealogy for the screen, an alternative history of the screen, not simply conceived as it has been as a window or as a mirror. In speaking about the screen, it's always been defined optically and as if it was a transparent window or simply a mirror that reflect. But I propose to think differently and to shift from optic to haptic, to think of the screen as a kind of membrane or as actually a texture that has an hapticity. In thinking of the projective screen this way, I mean to emphasize the actual condition of surface of the screen, the way in which it manifests itself as a texture, even if we often don't think of it. We just think of the images that are projected on screen as opposed to thinking of the screen itself as a kind of illuminated fabric. And bringing also together different screens in light of this surface materiality. Outside, sometimes even of figuration. So I want to also think about the way in which screens migrate across history and across cultures. So therefore kind of constructed a kind of media archaeology of the screen. This concern for material geography runs very deeply in my work, and as Victor has mentioned a bit earlier, in the first instance, in writing a book called Street Walking on a Ruined Map, I started thinking about the movie theater not as Plato's cave, so not as a space of illusion in which the spectators are chained to a chair, as in the myth of Plato's cave, but actually started to think of the spectator as somebody who, as Eisenstein actually said, was moving in his or her mind in terms of memories and forms of imagination. So I wanted to go street walking, moving around Plato's cave, suggesting to explore cinema not as an isolated and enclosed phenomenon, but as a mobile and shifting terrain, and also thinking about cinema in relation to the museum in that respect. In fact, when we see what's happening in the contemporary art galleries today, we realize that there is a much more closer relation between cinema and the museum, as the gallery spaces are becoming space of inhabitation of moving images and ways in which spectators move through these spaces. So in further mapping this cultural shift, in my other book called Atlas of Emotion, Journeys in Art, Architecture, and Film, I wanted to also talk about the relation between motion and emotion, ways in which in spectating in the museum and in cinema, we look at moving images and at the same time are moved by the images themselves. And today we move around art installations, so we actually see things in assemblage and in motion, and in that way we become actually moved. So spectators, to my mind, today are engaged in screen culture because of an interest in public space, in what I like to call, in the third book that I wrote, public intimacy. We come to a museum like the garage because we want to actually have an experience of public space, but we also have our own intimate experience of relating to an artwork together with total strangers. This is very similar to a movie theater, where we go and sit with people that sometimes we do not know. And so we share an experience of publicity, of public space, but at the same time have our own private, intimate experience of relating to the moving images in the screen. So to my mind, the return of interest in the museums is very much connected to a fundamental cinematic, public function or function of public intimacy in the that really comes from the cinema. So This geography, in fact, of exhibition we see today happening in the movie theaters. And this is an image from Christian Markley, famous installation. Actually, it's work called The Clock, which ran 24 hours in the museum. And it put together 2,000 sequences of films that depended on the different kind of hour. So, and it was synchronized with the way in which it was shown. So spectators actually followed, let's say, this kind of history of cinema, the entire history of cinema, as it displayed over 24 hours in the space of the museum. This kind of experience that we see today in the Contemporary Art Museum, as I mentioned, is an experience that actually belongs to ways in which the museum itself exhibits forms of sequencing and assemblages of space. The image you see here is from Lina Bo Bardi, an Italian architect who lived in most of her life in Brazil. And she designed a fantastic museum in Sao Paulo. And for the opening of the museum in the late 60s, she made an installation of paintings without ever using the walls, but actually using the images so that you would move through the space of the paintings, creating an actual cinematic installation, because you saw things in assemblage as if they were frames or sequences in a movie theater. And as a spectator, you moved around and created your own connections more clearly than you do in traditional museums. So this geography of exhibition suggests to me that there is a kind of strong connection between cinema and the museum, which goes back in time and at the same time is being reinforced today. So when we think about the screen, we cannot think about the screen in an isolated manner. To my mind, we have to understand that it is materially and historically connected to other forms of display. We call the screen today a display, but this kind of display, this form of exhibition, was in fact screening, an act of screening. So it is important that we consider cinema in relation to other forms of exhibition, and especially in relation to the function of exhibition in museum spaces. So, in fact, there is a material relation that emerges between cinema and other forms of exhibition spaces, and especially the birth of the museum. Cinema was invented at the same time as the museum became public or a public space. So there is an actual connection that's not only about the itineraries of assemblage, montage, and movement that exist in the museum, but also historically, the public museum actually came into existence at the same time as pre-cinematic forms of exhibition and display were historically invented. So cinema, the public museum was configured in its modern form at the same age of visual display that gave rise to the cinema, which was the art of modernity, and it shares with film the surface of communication, which is a visual theatrical architecture of spectatorship. So the cultural function of the screen, in fact, begins with the museum, and it evolves in conjunction with the visual arts and in interaction with the art surfaces and volumes. So to recognize this relation between art and film exhibition is particularly relevant in any attempt to now consider contemporary culture. When we approach the visual architecture of today, we in fact confront a hybrid landscape. Modes of reception in the visual arts and media are becoming more fluid and increasingly more mobile. The exhibition of film images has exited the space of the movie house and entered the space of the museum. Screens have multiplied they've changed scale, and different forms of viewership and also sites have emerged as places for screening. Moving images have migrated in the museum and established themselves as a solid presence as light spaces in the contemporary art scene. As a result, film itineraries are becoming much more closely connected to museum walks. This migration of screens has made it so that the relationship between art, architecture, and moving images is become stronger. The architectural wall and the gallery walls are not only becoming more like light spaces, they are also sometimes turned into literal screen surfaces. It is therefore important to consider the geography and the mobility of display and exhibition and think further about this in relation to museum and cinematic culture, and look more closely at screen space and their surfaces to make and understand a material turn in contemporary art. So in order to now consider more closely the projective space, I'd like to turn to a specific aspect of material culture and share with you the material history of the screen. I'm going to look at the emergence of the screen in history as a medium and outline the experimental theorization of the architecture of the screen in the 1920s in the work of the avant-garde, and then arrive at looking at some contemporary examples of the way in which the architecture of the screen and the screen fabric are configured today. In this way, I'd like to give you a sense of the transformation that have happened in the culture of and the act of screening, and the shifting histories that have taken place, particularly giving attention to the textural quality of the screen as a support for the image, as a structure in itself, as an architecture in itself. So let's make a step back into history and look at the way in which the screen emerged in history. In developing the idea that the screen is an architecture and also creates a space, creates an architecture, it is important to look at the actual material history of the screen, and the material culture out of which the screen emerged, because it displays aspects of a cultural history. The history of the screen is inscribed in what the philosopher Jacques Rancière calls the surface of design, because it is written in the actual etymology as well as in the history of the word screen. The idea of the screen, we think, is contemporary. Right? We're surrounded by screen, digital screens, every kind of screen, and we think of screens in relation to perhaps the invention of cinema. But in fact, the first time that the word screen emerged was in the late Renaissance, way back before the invention of any screening technology. The word screen came from an old Germanic root, scrim, which remained in the English language as screen, but also spread to Latin languages. In French, you say écran to speak of the screen, and in Italian, you say schermo. It's the same etymology. So, early Renaissance, late Middle Ages is the time when the screen emerges. And what did the screen mean at that time, since there were no technologies of screening? Well, the word screen comes from architecture. The screen is an architectural object. It's a structure. It usually defined a floor-standing piece of furniture that consisted of a sheet of lighter, often translucent material that could be paper, some kind of fabric, and that was stretched on a wooden frame, or sometimes a series of connected folding frames. And this was the meaning of the screen all the way until the 19th century. So the screen was a framed architecture with translucent filtering of light for many centuries until the 19th century. In the 19th century, the fabrication of the screen, its textural materiality, changed into a different kind of fabric. The material state of the screen was altered and a different state of matter emerged. The form of a translucent membrane, a site of filtering light, expanded to become a surface for projection. So transferring from architectural space to the realm of pre-cinema and pre-cinematic media, the screen arrived at defining a plane for the transmission of luminous images. It is very significant that in the Century Dictionary and Cyclopedia, which was published in 1899, the screen was still defined first architecturally as and I'm citing from the encyclopedia, a covered framework, a partition, or a curtain, as in a fire screen, or a folding screen, or a window screen. And then eventually, this idea, this architecture of the screen, it became and included a form of observational veiling of space, and as the encyclopedia says, a screen upon which images can be cast by a magic lantern. The history of the screen and its evolution teaches us that what we now call screen and understand to be a projective surfaces originated in the world of objects, material space, architecture, interior design. The screen was a thing. It was an object of furniture, a domestic item that inhabited interiors. It acted especially to negotiate inside and outside and materially transform space. When developed to divide space in the home, a screen mediated between private and public zones of habitation and could create privacy and publicity, privacy and intimacy. The folding screen, as it is still used in homes and especially in Japanese houses, often presented itself as a framed surface that filtered and diffused light. And it was also richly illustrated with images. So it actually was pre-cinematic because it was decorated with images, as well as creating this passage of light, this filtering of light, and this transition between inside and outside. The screen was not just a visual object, however, it was an actual piece of material culture, a matter of decoration and adornment. And this ornament could also be ornate. There were different forms of screens, even portable forms of screens, that could respond to a personal ornamental desire. So in the many configurations that the screen took, it was actually a plastic visibility, and yet the screen was an imaginary structure. It had a material substance, but the material substance could activate and animate the dimension of the imagination. In other words, the screen was a veritable piece of interior design. It was this particular object of decor that filtered light, that connected together interior and exterior space through translucency and through the filtering of light, that made possible an imaginary passage, foreshadowing the idea of what a screen is today and what potential forms of projection it can hold for us for the future. It was such an object that we find both reflected and projected in what we think today a screen is and in our contemporary screen world. When we encounter the screen as an object, in fact, we can experience at a very tangible level how the projective potential, the very fabric of the screen, stems from a history of folding together architecture, and interior design with moving images in luminous forms of imaginary projection. But what we experience today was true from the very beginning, because the screen was constituted as a space of passage in which also art forms could be connected. The material history of the screen that I have outlined shows us that the screen was a place of crossover in which the visual arts and the spatial arts could come together. The screen was a vessel of transformation. It was the material support onto which images come into being and, in a luminous passage, flow across time, across media conditions. As a material medium connecting together art, architecture, and moving images, the screen is therefore a very stretchy fabric. It is the site of projections of intermediality. On this pliant and reflective surface, shifts in media can take place materially and become palpable to our senses in what I like to call surface tension, in the surface tension of media. So if I continue to probe the surface of design as it relates to the screen, it's because it is important to understand the intermedial transit that are materially written today on screen surface. When I trace the history of the design form of the screen, it's to expose the rich potentiality of screen space, how it functions as a passage, as a transitional site, and even as a relational space. I keep pursuing the surface of design because by distributing surfaces, we design partitions that also enable us to partake in communal space. Forms of superficial envelopment in the visible world involve the sensible realm of architecture, texture, and inhabitation. In thinking of the screen in this way, I want to emphasize that this surface comes into play as a partition which we can also partake in communal way. It mediates by acting as a material configuration of how the visible meets the thinkable and informs a sensible dwelling in the social material world. So in many ways, this goes back to what I mentioned before about the idea of the screen returning from the cinema into the museum space to create a form of public intimacy, so to re-become a kind of public architecture that connects inside and outside, interior space with exterior space. So to advance further in this idea of thinking of the screen as a transitional architecture and to design screen space as an environment transformation, I also want to take a clue from a poet and a critic, Vasa Lindsey, who wrote in very interesting way about the screen when the screens were actually invented. So back in 1915, he offered a pioneering theorization of cinema in a book called The Art of Moving Pictures, and talked about the screen as an architecture of passage, as a place of crossover between interior and exterior space. He located the capacity of the screen in the profound hybridity of this form. The possibility of crossing world afforded by the art of moving picture was inseparable from a movement between and across art forms. In pointing to what would be at that time the potential of the screen in 1915, he described the screen in interesting ways. He called it a sculpture in motion, which is the way in which contemporary art, this is Tobias Putri, who makes architectural screens in the art gallery, constructs a screen as a sculpture, in fact. He also called it painting in motion or architecture in motion, and even sometimes considered the screen furniture in motion, which is exactly what the screens have become today. I mean, what is our portable screen? What is the screen of our computer? What is the screen of our cell phone? Nothing but a piece of furniture in motion, sometimes even a cabinet to which we entrust all our memories, all our images, all our pictures, all our ways of connecting and with other people, all our intimate space, as if it was an actual closet, is now the screen. So back in 1915, this interesting poet and philosopher understood the function of the screen as a sculpture, as an architecture, as a painting, and as a furniture in motion. It's very important that it would be in motion. In emphasizing that the screen constitutes an architecture in motion, he called attention to the capacity of the screen to convey surfaces and textures. On the screen, he affirmed in 1915, and I quote, "Tones, textures, lines, and spaces take on a vitality which is almost like that of flesh and blood," end quote. So a few years later, the tensile hybridity of the screen as a form of projection came to be practiced and theorized in the work of Laszlo MoholyNagy, a very interesting avant-garde artist who was a transdisciplinary artist who pursued his ideas in very different mediums, in painting, photography, and design, but considering light to be the material connection among all the mediums that he actually practiced and theorized. What you see here is a kinetic sculpture that he called light space modulator, which actually looks like a film projector. It moves around and projects light as if it was itself not just a sculpture in motion, but an actual projector, so in the way in which Lindsey conceived of the projecting form. For him, light was not just a space per se, but something that could modulate and transform space. Light space modulator. So light is in fact something that can modulate the different rhythm of a space, create even moods, create emotional change in the space itself. In a book entitled Painting, Photography, Film, published in 1925, MoholyNagy articulated this idea theoretically. For him, light becomes the connecting thread between film, photography, and painting because it is an essential material condition of viewing. Light is a sensitive, vibrant material that appeared first in painting to activate a casting of forms and a sense of vision in motion, a form of projection, before it was acted upon chemically in the age of mechanical reproduction. Here you see one of the many paintings that were produced in the 18th century called The Origin of Painting, which in fact, to my mind, it's the origin of projection. This is the beginning of my next book, by arguing that in fact the origin of painting is nothing but the origin of projection. You see how light is cast by a lantern, which then becomes an actual projection and cast upon a wall that turns into a screen, for the image of the young man is virtually in a sense projected, cast upon this wall that turns into a screen by way of a filtering of light. And it is interesting that it is a woman that's drawing the silhouette. So the origin of painting is the origin of projection in her hands. So in theorizing luminosity across different media, MoholyNagy recognized this and connected together painting with pigment to light display projected, texturally relating the material pigment and the material light. So speaking of painting with light, in a 1936 essay entitled Light Architecture, MoholyNagy first continued to interweave painting, film, photography, and architecture together, proposing to transform bidimensionality into a plastic, luminous plane with a form of projection that could connect and animate haptically and tangibly all of these different surfaces. Different textures might be created with materials that respond to projected light in a way that surfaces could be activated, change, and morph. He made painting, architecture, and film into surfaces of movement and potential transformation by emphasizing textures and material textures, the sensation, the haptic sensation of touching surfaces as a quality of this medium that can capture luminous spectrums. MoholyNagy recognized the powerful presence of the screen as an architectural surface. He devoted a lot of thinking to the architecture of the screen in a chapter of painting, photography, and film that was significantly titled Simultaneous or Polycinema. He suggested that the screen as a space could be architected creatively. It could be configured in different forms and made into diverse planes or shapes. So everything that's happening today in the contemporary art gallery was in fact dreamed upon by MoholyNagy in 1925. And I want to read you a passage from this book to explore this idea. He said, one can, for example, visualize the normal projection plane being divided by a simple adapter into different obliquely positioned planes and chambers, like a landscape of mountains and valleys. Another suggestion for changing the projection screen might be one in the shape of a segment of a sphere instead of the present rectangular one. More than one film could be projected on the screen, and they would not be projected in a fixed spot, but would range continually from left to right, from up and down, from right to left. Two or more events will combine and present parallel and coinciding episodes. In MoholyNagy imaginative experimentation, the screens ends up being constructed spatially. He calls it a landscape. It is actually a cityscape. This artist likens the screen to a simultaneous array of sounds made by the means of transport that mobilize and create an urban landscape. In this sense, the tonal landscape of MoholyNagy, polycinema, becomes in fact polyphonic. The landscape screen is not a single geometry, but a polymorphic landscape, because multiple projections are championed in this way. MoholyNagy imagines screening a sequence of pictures simultaneously and projecting extra prints of the same film running on the screen to projectors that would be standing next to one another. So this is really what's happening in the contemporary art gallery today, dreamt upon in 1925. So when MoholyNagy proposes to combine screens in these planar projections of movement, it is in order to arrive at a different architecture of viewing. The multiple screen is a very complex and interesting architecture. It is a tensile surface, a membrane-like space that can enable us to feel simultaneity, parallelism, and polyphonic combination of heterogeneous situation. What this is in fact a surface of communication that was imagined and dreamt upon way before multiple windows could be opened on a computer screen. In suggesting to free the projection screen from a form of fixed and static placement, one can polyphonically imagine with MoholyNagy the mobile surface of what we know today as the screen of digital culture, but also what was known in the 1960s as a cinematic expanded landscape of expanded cinema. In fact, in the avant-garde experiment and the experimental theory of the 1920s, there are elements of connection and with the experimental and expanded cinema practices of the 1960s, which in turn relate to the directions taken today by media practices and artistic enterprises with regards to the screen. Although the screen is often still lacking in serious theorization, especially by itself, outside of the images that are projected upon it, outside of figuration, by now the architecture of the screen has turned into an actual material condition of our experience. We live in an environment of screen surfaces, which hold different planes, host simultaneity, and enhance combinations and connectivity. We are surrounded by screens, which, as Vasa Lindsey foresaw back in 1915, are in fact pieces of sculptures in motion, haptic object of transport with a material configuration and a real plastic quality. The portable digital screen is an architecture in motion that moves with us, and it functions as an actual piece of furniture in motion in our homes. The art gallery and the museum have also become site of screening experiments that resonate very strongly with the media archaeology and the avant-garde practices of screening that I've just outlined for you. Screen-based new media practices work with the creative potential of screening by expanding the size of the screen, the scale of the screen, its capacity to project, by multiplying and magnifying the number of screens, split screens, double screens, multiple projector, expanded relations between multiple screens are now fully in place in the art gallery and the museum. The act of screening has also incorporated other polyphonic potentials and more mobility. We pursue virtual movement with screens. And also this means less fixity in the conceptual configuration of how we imagine and understand how a screen functions in art and in our culture. So the screen has become the surface of an aesthetic and mediatic transformation. Screen space is more conceptually lighter, more mobile, and the texture of the screen incorporates fluidity. This aesthetic phenomenon I call the surface tension of media, and it includes the creation of screen membranes and curtain screens in the art gallery. Made of translucent fabric, the contemporary screen is conceptually closer to the surface of a canvas or a sheet, a shade, a curtain, and even a drape. Partition, shelter, and veil, it can be a permeable material envelope, and it is a space that it is inhabited, is a space of inhabitation. In this textural sense, the contemporary art screen refashions the very archaeology of the medium that I just outlined for you at the beginning of the lecture, because it is emphasizing the origin of the screen in architecture, in fact, as a form of filtering of light, as a curtain, as a veil, so a place of observational veiling and filtering of space, which is how the screen emerged in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, and what it has actually become today with digital projection. To think of screening in this way means to highlight that there is a movement between art forms also appearing on the surface of the screen, altering states of matter. So, for example, when MoholyNagy emphasized light as a way to connect together a painting to photography, to architecture, to film, he envisioned experiments that find a position in contemporary forms of experimentation where light is more and more used by artist and architect alike as a material form of passage. This connective thread involves linking together the luminous material conditions of viewing in the visual arts and media, and it's very much alive. New material relations are arising today between art, architecture, fashion, design, film, and new media in a range of practices that are pushing the boundaries of their specific medium, pursuing new forms of materiality through the use of such materials as technologies of light. Light is an actual material. It's not just a technology. Transitive movements of the arts reside today within haptic, vibrant environments of projection. In the ebb and flow of technological change, the art of projection has found new ways to hold our fascination in interart forms. This contemporary refashioning of surface space in the art of projection also suggests that we should rethink the surface of walls, of windows, and of screens, and understand them together, canvas, wall, window screen as permeable membranes. So let me offer you a concrete example of this more philosophical way of thinking, and a particular example of what I mean when I say the surface tension of media, this connection together of different surfaces, of screen and walls and canvases. I would like to offer you some examples that come from the practice of an artist named Krzysztof Wodiczko. I'm not entirely sure how known it is in this country. I thought maybe he was less known than most of the artists you know. So I chose an example that may be less self-evident. Krzysztof Wodiczko is a Polish-born artist who lives in New York and in Cambridge, and he has made over 80 public works of projection in public spaces. So it's a very extensive practice that he has, sort of projecting screening of lights on public buildings. He uses visual technology and new media to change the way in which we perceive public art. The medium of projection is used by Krzysztof Wodiczko to make the face, the face of the surface, and the facade into dense architectural surfaces and mediated experiences of memory, history, and subjectivity. Exposes the actual architecture of projection in material mediatic form. His projection sensitizes us to the texture of the surface onto which he projects. The space onto which the images are projected is never invisible, but is actually rendered tangible. For example, in this projection you see here, called the Tijuana projection, he animated the human body in projection against the body of the building form. So the face and the facade of the building were connected as surfaces. And of course, in the word surface, at least in English, in Italian, and in French, you have the face inside the surface itself. So you have face and facade as superficial matters. And here you see them together. The face of a woman that speaks her story is projected as if her facial skin was entirely adhering onto the surface of the dome of the city's cultural center. In another projection called Hiroshima projection, hands that are gesticulating are projected in close-up onto the moving surface of a river. In this way, appearing as if they would animate the mnemonic flow of the trauma of Hiroshima. In this work, the moving image is carved out of the material surface of the architecture that supports it, animates it, and moves it. The architectural surface acts for Wodiczko as a partition. It functions as if it was an actual visible screen. Guests, an installation from 2009 perhaps makes this even more evident. When you walked into the dark space of the Venice Biennale Pavilion, you thought you were seeing 8 windows scattered on 3 walls and looking up one skylight. But these walls didn't have any openings. These frames were not carved in stone. The windows were projections. They were screens onto which you could catch glimpses of the life of immigrants, the guest, the unwanted guest, very often, of the country we're in. If you see something from 2005, it was also structured very similarly. The surface of this imaginary windowed architecture functioned as an elaborate form of mediation, for these luminous screens provided access to the personal narratives of society's invisible citizens, the guests, the immigrants. It is significant that the migrants were never seen and never heard clearly. They appeared as shadows through the light, silhouettes in a digital shadow theater. The interrelation between visibility and invisibility in society is concretely materialized here, uncovered on the non-existent panes of glass windows that are dressed as if they were screens. As we look closely at these walls, which are windows, we can actually perceive them as screen surfaces. In order to see, we must navigate through a surface that is visually conceived and configured as a very dense material. Milky texture substance appears to our senses, and acting as a cover for the window walls mediates the relationship between who's seeing and who's being seen. In this sense, we perceive the actual materiality of projection. The tissue, the visual tissue, the veiling of projection, the architectural veiling of projection. So it is not just the function, but the consistency of these window walls that is closely related to the fabric of the screen. Through this material manifestation, we can perceive and envisage the support of the image and the representational medium. The projection screen is never invisible here, but made palpable as projective matter. And so as we try to make out the foggy figures of the migrants, of the displaced people, and try to hear their stories through muffled sound, we experience the actual mediatic quality of the screen as a veiled and veiling surface. If you see something and guess, display the actual material of projection. And because the surface is made so physically, tangibly present, it even shows a pellicular quality. In this installation, the screen actually acts as if it were a membrane. The figures move in a blur, and their contours comes in and out of focus, becoming more consistent as they approach the limit of the screen. So the effect makes it almost feel as if the screen was a tissue, a permeable membrane, a thin kind of sheet that could be that is not transparent but could be trespassed. The screen appears almost as if it was a membrane that could be actually stretched by the movement. Sometimes Wodiczko, who has an incredible sense of humor, despite being an incredibly serious artist, even makes a joke about the permeability and the malleability of the screen. At some point, he shows people trying to desperately clean this foggy surface by making it transparent so people could actually pass through it. Lots of rain in this particular surface. The veil continued to become more and more foggy, and as the rain constantly falls, and the screen become more and more impossible to clean and to become transparent window. They're translucent, not transparent. Some visitors to the installation come up to the site of projection as if wishing the space could extend and stretch like a membrane. And in turn, the migrants act as if the partition could bend or warp to create a passage. They hold objects, pictures to the site of the screen, hoping that something could pass through, that it could reach you on the other side, that the screen could actually become this form of transitional passage. So they act as if the partition could warp, they create a passage, it could visually be traversed as if it was a veil, a curtain. So the architectural screen of which I spoke earlier. They push the body, even their body up to the surface. They hold up hands, pictures, and objects, as if wishing to push them through a layer of tissue. In many ways, this screen turns out to be elastic, flexible, and pliant. So surface tension happens here. This membrane is an actual screen in the sense that it is a partition. On this site of partitions, the migrants can negotiate status and story, for this membrane-like surface acts simultaneously as a protective layer and as a wall. There is substance, which is also a form of resistance in this material of projection. As if to rebel against their status as shadows, the migrants push up against the partition as if they would push against an actual border. But let us not forget that this virtual architecture constructed by Wodiczko is also a window. That is, it is the kind of architecture in which positions between inside and outside can be mediated and changed. In this capacity as a window, as an aperture onto the world, the resilient surface of the screen doesn't simply divide, but also enables a passage, which can also become a potential crossing of borders. Possibilities of openings and a hope for exchange can be sited on this composite, tensile, permeable screen surface that acts as a membrane. So, recalling the experimental history of light and space installations, the projective passage refashions the actual form of surface tension that occurs on a film screen. Coded in this material of projection, this is a space of traversal that also includes the spectators. As a visitor to this space, you are never positioned on the one side of the screen or the other, but you always stand on the border. For in order to perceive, you must cross over and project yourself across the threshold. The fabric of the screen is so absorbent that it absorbs us, the viewers too, in surface tension. To look is to feel this tension, challenging who is inside and who is outside. You can never stare to screen surface. The tension of this tensile surface forces you to become engaged, to the point of wishing that borders might be crossed and contact might be made through the membrane of the screen across the fabric of the screen, as we do today in our digital medium, as we make contact through the screen membrane, not just looking at it, but crossing over by making material relations virtually with other people across the screen. So this is not just about looking, it's about contact and touching other people. Not a site of critical distance, this kind of screen is both resistant and embracing because it holds emotions and affects in its fabric. The porous membrane can even enable the passage of empathy, which is itself, of course, a form of projection. In staging an epidermic and touching form of exchange, the surface membrane of the screen mediates potential for relations and relatedness among people inscribed in its very surface. And so the memory of film also comes to surface in this installation form embodied in digital space. The indexical quality of celluloid may no longer be with us. The cinema may be obsolete, but the new pellicular membrane of digital culture is just as effectively tensile. The digital can hold us in deeply articulated surface tension, rather than flat dimensionality, a dimension of volume, texture, and depth, and different forms of materiality and material relation continue to emerge in contemporary art from the surface of the screen, especially in moving image installations such as the one of Krzysztof Wodiczko that I just spoke about. The sense of material culture is conveyed not simply through the screen, but through the entire space of projection. The visible is here a quality pregnant with a texture. The atmosphere of projection is very thick. It is dense with emotions, with moody, luminous particles dancing in space, imbued with an air of cloudy, permeable palpability. Projection was always a space, was always an architecture, was always an environment, and it is becoming even more so an atmosphere of vital energy in contemporary art. Screen space is a site haunted by the perturbation of surfaces. To fully sense these textural matters, think again of the material history of the screen and of the surface of design in history with which I began this lecture. Remember what we said some time ago, that material consistency was the material base of the act of screening, as it emerged from the design of and the architecture of the window screen, the fire screen, and then turned into the exhibition space of the magic lantern and phantasmagoria. The idea of the act of screening and of projection was historically born out not simply of architecture, but of atmosphere and atmospheric surfaces. the act of projection, was designed to make images flare out and move in the way Lucretius envisioned it, surfacing from the fabric of light and the density of air. Early forms of projection were a weathered kind of space, as the phantasmagoria of projection was imbued with such vaporous things as smoke and fog. Projection is indeed closely associated with elusive substances of light and atmosphere, associated to the hazy, misty quality of shades, silhouettes, and shadows, which were even actually materialized on the early screens of silent cinema. It is no wonder then that such surfaces of material resistance and permeability, integral to the very activity of screening, would find its own digital substance in a new atmosphere of projection in the contemporary art gallery and the museum. In these new viewing chambers, the force of light persists, along with shadow play. A place of passage and a point of contact between worlds, the screen is therefore a real medium. It continues to mediate today, crossing the borders of media in surface tension. In the atmosphere of projection, a form of curtaining, partitioning, and partaking of communal space takes place beyond medium specificity. The screen is being reinvented today as a material architecture of becoming, a tensile surface that connects and mediates among people and through art forms. So, far from being responsible for dematerialization, the fascination with screening and projection in the art gallery refashions sensations, sensory, transformative, communal architecture of exhibition and materiality. It reactivates the public dimension that originated in the public space of the museum and of the cinema. Gallery screening, in fact, offer a kind of renewed experience of the public sphere and of public intimacy. And so, as the shadow theater that was cinema is reconfigured and rematerialized architecturally in new media, moving image installations in the art gallery, the white cube of the gallery turns again luminously dark, and we returned to the absorbent, envisioning, relational fabric of projection displayed on yet another form of screen membrane. So, to conclude, surface tension of media emerges, in my view, as a central condition of contemporary visual culture, visual art, and architecture, resignaling a refashioning of materiality and of material sensations on our cultural screens. The surface is poised to be at the center of this process of rematerialization insofar as it constitutes a connective threshold. As a form of dwelling that engages the mediation and the relation between subject and object, the surface is the very site of epidermic projection. In the act of screening, the material of surface expresses a new materiality as it is texturally reconfigured to hold different forms of material relation and also convey their transformation. So, threading together all these movements and observing these processes, we must rethink the relation between canvas, wall, and screen, whose matter states is constantly altered and renewed in new forms of projection. The surface is here turned not only into a membrane, but into a real structure. The surface is no longer an incidental part of the artwork. The surface is the structure of contemporary material artworks. It is stretched in contemporary art and pushed to the limit of its potential to become the actual core and the actual structure of the piece. In also most of the architectural work that I consider more at length in the book, the surface becomes a reinterpretation of ornamentation that becomes no longer superficially simply adornment, but the actual material structure of new architecture, which are renewed in tensile luminosity, and light materiality. In this aesthetic of minimal simplicity, attention to material defines a surface condition that affirms materiality in the largest sense of that term. In the material intersection between inside and outside played out on the surface, a layered thick surface of interaction between us and the world that surrounds us, between interiority and exteriority, emerges in time. The pliant surface of projection is in fact capable of retaining the inner structure of temporality and the folds of memory in its material substance. It can also express sensations, the sensorium of affects, the sensations of moods, and even the sensuality of an atmosphere. It is in this sense that I want to finally read the surface as an architecture. Not only does it constitute a space in itself, it is a maker of space and of space of material relations. This surface is not flat. It is densely built up in transformative layers and deeply tensile. It is a landscape of projective motion and a place of connection, contact, and connectivity. The surface, far from being superficial, is a consequential moving entity. It is a space of real dimension, a site of intimacy that can in turn be inhabited. In other words, the surface is a real screen, a site that's capable of holding the very fabric of material relations, the surface of a depth. Thank you.
Друзья, какие вопросы?
Are there any questions from the audience?
Пожалуйста.
You're welcome to ask your questions.
Спасибо большое
Thank you
вам,
very
Giuliana,
much
за прекрасную лекцию. Спасибо большое
for your beautiful
Художественному музею
lectures.
Художественному
Thank you.
журналу
I would
и
like to
Музею
thank both the
современного
Arts
искусства «Гараж» за то,
Magazine
что
and Garage
пригласили
Museum
такого замечательного
for
спикера.
inviting
Я,
such a
когда читала
brilliant
вашу книгу
speaker
год
here.
назад, даже не мечтала,
I
что через
never
какое-то
dreamt
время можно будет так лично вам задать
that
вопрос.
I could
Позвольте
ask a
уточнить
question in person.
такой момент в теории медиа,
So I
который является,
wanted to
наверное,
ask you
основным
about
для
media theory.
понимания медиа в цифровую эпоху. Как вам кажется,
What do you
трансформация
think
от аналоговых медиа к цифровым,
about
которая выражается всё
transformation
в большем и большем
of
доминировании
analog
экранов, в
media
том числе
into
вокруг
digital
нас,
media,
да,
and we
в
see
нашей
digital media
повседневности,
everywhere
в
around
культурной
us.
сфере. Как выражается
So
в таком измерении, как
how
онтологическое
is it
измерение? Вот вы упоминали
expressed
Платона,
in
да, есть ли у него связь с
ontological
заложниками
dimension?
уже
You
цифровой
mentioned
пещеры? То есть,
Plato.
как меняется
So
онтология,
how does ontology
в которой мы
change
пребываем благодаря трансформации от
where we
аналогового
are
к
due to
цифровому?
the
Если это предмет
transformations?
вашего интереса, могли бы вы
So if you
поподробнее
could
рассказать?
tell us something about it.
Thank you. Sì, sì, ho capito, ho capito. Well, thank you very much for, first of all, for the compliments and also for this very interesting but very large question. I am not entirely sure I can answer it in this such a short time, but let me say that as I think I began to discuss with this lecture, and it's much more articulated in my books, I do not look at the digital culture in opposition to analog. I think that this idea of opposing together analog and digital is not going to take us anywhere in particular. Of course, there are differences, there are technical differences in the materiality and even in the ontology, as you put it, of the image. But I am much more interested in the passages, and I'm much more interested in media archaeology in some way, because there are certain potentiality of what's happening today in contemporary digital culture, which were expressed in analog culture and even in pre-analog culture, if you like. So in a sense, rather than pitting them against each other, I'm much more interested in looking at the transitions and in the not in necessarily the continuity, but the kind of different layers of temporality that exist. I'm not looking at this as a kind of teleological change from analog to digital, but rather thinking of temporalities as having gaps, as having cuts, as having layers, as having, in a sense, flashbacks and flash forwards at the same time. So I think some of the things that can happen today were, in a sense, understood and made possible in forms of dreaming. That happened during the analog period. So think, for example, of the example of Laszlo MoholyNagy. I mean, he couldn't do it at that time, but he could dream of the idea of this simultaneity, of windows opening on a similar screen. He could dream of several projections onto one large screen, moving up and down in different directions. So everything that's become possible with the digital was in fact not invented then, but was perhaps dreamt, sometimes as a form of potentiality by visionary artists who thought of it in different forms. And when you think of Krzysztof Wodiczko, I mean, he works in digital media. But what he's doing is, in a sense, showing us the materiality of wall, of canvas, of screens, and taking us all the way back to the genealogy of the screen in architecture, to all the way back to the Middle Ages and to the early Renaissance, when the idea of the screen emerged as an architectural form. So I think this is much more productive, to my mind, than continuing to make opposite happen and also pitting things against each other. And also, you know, by now we're living in this culture. So that's the most important thing, is to observe it and understand what kind of forms of potentiality we can express for the future that also contain history within themselves. Not because I think of history as a nostalgic moment, but because I think history is a moment in which possibilities are opened up. So, for example, in this new book that I'm writing, which is all about contemporary art, I go all the way back to the idea of projection in alchemy in the 15th century, when in fact material conditions transformed materials themselves and created a new form. And I'm looking at this because many of the contemporary artists I'm interested in are in fact reinventing obsolete forms of projection that existed even before cinema. So they're going not only back to analog, they're going back to panoramic paintings, they're going back to panoramic wallpapers, they're going back to camera obscuras or phantasmagoric spectacle or camera obscuras. So there's a way in which you can see a relation really happening in digital culture that connects us together to the history of analog, to what analog could not express sometimes, not just what it did, but what it couldn't do, and what we can do today, opening up potentiality.
Дорогие друзья, к сожалению, нас уже очень сильно поджимает время, поэтому
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so you can ask questions later in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you.